Our culture has left Christianity behind. It seeks to form us in its own image. Just like Daniel and his friends, young followers of Jesus must find a new way to embody their faith, one that's faithful to Jesus' teachings and one that is creatively missional towards culture. This is our calling. This is our battle. This is the Daniel generation. Hey guys, welcome to the Daniel generation, episode 1 of the podcast, officially. Last time you saw, it was just me on the camera, and that was more of an intro. To those of you who emailed me ideas of things you want to cover, things you'd benefit from, I really appreciate that. We'll be sure to get some of those going. Joining me today, we have Caleb. He's going to be helping out, just asking some questions and making sure I don't use big words without explaining them. So
yeah, because I'm not as learned as this man right here. So I try and bring him down a little bit to the normal person's level, I feel like.
I had some friends back in Phoenix that would have this, they would make like a buzzer sound and called it buzzwords with Drew. So when I'd use like too big of a word, they would just go buzzword and then I'd have to explain it for everybody. So
yeah, I might be doing that or a version of it.
Yeah, we could do like a little segment even where it like has like a little music intro, breaks away, and then I have to explain it in like 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, we could do something
buzzwords
like
with
that.
Drew.
Yeah,
maybe.
And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Anyways, so this episode, we're going to be diving deep into the story of Daniel, the prophet in the Old Testament. I mean, because his name is in the podcast. And we'll explain why his story is relevant to us as young Christians today, how we could benefit from trying to model his way of life a little bit. And then we'll discuss some of the ways that we can do that.
Cool.
So, yeah. With that, we'll dive right into episode 1. So, Daniel was in a culture that was not his own, right? So he's in a time when Israel was exiled to Babel. And if you're a Jew in that time, Babel is pretty much the epitome of everything that you're not supposed to become. So the whole old covenant that God gave to his people was all about not being like the nations, not having a ton of gold, huge armies, and worshiping false gods. And Babel is pretty much the epitome of all these things that Israel's not supposed to be. So if you're an Israelite exiled in this culture, it's kind of like being among the people that you scorn the most. So that's where he found himself. But the other thing about Babel is they were the most powerful nation at the time. And one of the reasons they were is because when they would conquer somebody, they didn't just, kill all the men and take all the women. They would actually take them all into their capital city and re-educate them with their culture, their custom, their religion, and basically turn them into their own people.
Right.
And
so they grew
destroy.
through conquering instead of just kind of conquering.
Yeah. Instead of just burning your town, they took it a step further and they would actually take you away from your entire, home and re-educate you. And then at the end of that process, the goal is that you would look a lot more like them.
Right.
So obviously, if you're someone who's an Israelite and your whole identity as a people is built off of not being that way, and now you're in a foreign land, away from all of your old religious customs, away from your old farm, your old home, and you have this king who's trying to re-educate you, it's pretty tough, especially as a young guy like Daniel, who is, probably about our age, to stay faithful as a Jew. Literally the whole system was designed to strip that from him.
Right.
So they actually would do this. They would take young guys and put them in the king's court, which is prestigious, right? And they would give them fine wine and all the best perks and re-educate them. And the goal was that, you'd get all the wisdom of having these people in your court. They'd feel important, and then they wouldn't have any sort of sentimentality when it came to, ditching their old way of life.
Right. And they see the benefits,
exactly,
quote unquote, of adapting to the new lifestyle. And therefore, why would they want to go back?
Yeah, exactly.
That's an interesting way of doing it.
Yeah.
I've never heard of any other nation doing that with their captives.
Yeah. Well, Rome would do it, and Greece did it in a different way. Instead of, taking you all to their capital, they would actually just send out philosophers and, poets and things like that to reculture you in your own place, to Hellenize you, like Hellenistic culture. So it's a pretty common strategy.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, Daniel's story is a little different because he didn't really like this idea. Whereas some of his peers that aren't mentioned in the book could have totally accepted this idea, and certainly other nations did. Daniel and his friends had a bit of a different approach. So the whole Daniel fast, for instance, comes from one of the first chapters of Daniel, when he's invited to this court and they're trying to basically tempt him with fine wine and all these gifts. And he refuses to eat the meat and the wine and the bread, and just eat vegetables. So that's actually where the Daniel fast comes from.
Interesting.
But the fascinating part about it is the guy who's in charge of all of them doesn't want them to do this because, if you're not eating what they're eating, the king will know you're not getting fat, and then he'll cut my head off. Right. And Daniel says, well, my God is great. I'll eat vegetables and get fatter than them. Right. And that's what happens. So the Daniel fast is kind of funny because it's like a way for us to like lose weight and be churchy about it. But really, he ate vegetables and got fat. And
that's interesting.
But that sets forth kind of the paradigm that Daniel has is he's in the midst of this culture that's trying to destroy his way of life, but he's carving out a way to be faithful in the midst of it.
Right.
And I mean, quite literally, there's moment after moment where when Daniel is just doing what a good Jew does, his life is threatened for it. So he's thrown into the lion's den. His friends, they throw him into a furnace. But all those times, they actually survive because of their faithfulness. God preserves them miraculously or otherwise.
Makes me think of when you talk about you can have the earthly things now or eternal things later, right?
Yeah.
And you think about it, like earthly things now would have been him accepting all that, all the food and all the whatever, but then he would have lost God. I mean, in a sense.
Yeah.
And then instead of that, he stays with God, and then God gets him through all this anyway. Like,
yeah.
So really it was like, of course you can just, and then you get eternity.
Yeah. And what's even cooler about this is Daniel, in being who he is, if he's not, surviving miraculously being burned or thrown into a lion's den, he and his friends, if they're not, miraculously being delivered from something like that, the way they act actually blesses the people around them. So, for instance, when they eat vegetables and get fat, that actually looks good on the king's counselor who's organizing the whole thing. And that, that saves his life.
Right.
Another instance when Daniel is the only one in the land who can interpret the king's dream. And he saves all of the magicians' lives because none of them were able to do it. And the king was like, I'm going to kill all of you if you can't do this. So, and then more than that, Nebuchadnezzar actually ends up writing a song of praise to God, to Yahweh as the only true God and the Most High, which is fascinating because if that's what's happening, this is someone who thinks they're a son of God, who worships, pagan gods, Eastern gods. And they're now saying, oh, this Yahweh is actually more powerful than any God I've ever worshipped. That's kind of winning.
Yeah.
But not in a way that we would think of. It's not like Daniel went in there and preached a sermon and said, turn or burn, and everyone just, flipped and became Jewish.
Right.
He was just living faithfully. And that brought light, kind of like when Jesus says we're salt of the earth, light of the earth. Well, the Jews were supposed to be the same thing in the Old Covenant. And Daniel's modeling that in a way where he doesn't have to use the sword and he doesn't have to be some gifted orator, but just being a faithful Jew actually changes the hearts of people around him.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd never really thought about that too much because you always just hear of the lion's den, right?
Yeah, it's our favorite Sunday school story.
And then like the more you're talking about it, the more I'm like, man, that's like barely part of it.
Yeah.
You're kind of missing the point, honestly. So
yeah, there's a lot of theological scholars are really talking about this story right now, which is kind of why we named the podcast after Daniel. And they have a term for what he's doing. It's called creative minority, because he's clearly the minority. Daniel does not have any say when it comes to how Babel should run, but he's creatively living as the minority. And by doing that, by being faithful to God, who is the king above kings, that's actually what allows him to take these positions of power. And there's a parallel kind of in the narrative between him and Joseph and the same sort of things.
That's definitely what I've been thinking of this whole time.
Yeah.
Joseph. Like, isn't that like the same story?
Oh, it pretty much is the same
Very
story.
similar.
Except it doesn't really say how Daniel got there. It probably wasn't his brothers selling him into slavery.
Probably not.
Yeah. So now the reason we bring all that up, and hopefully people listening have started to kind of notice this, is Daniel's situation in a lot of ways, not one-to-one, but in a lot of ways is pretty similar to where we're at least in American Western culture.
Yeah, for sure. I think definitely Western culture.
Yeah.
It's as you're going, I don't want to like jump ahead, so I'm not going to yet. But I've been thinking, I'm like, oh man, there's so many things that I could like attribute. There's the same type of thing in society right now.
Yeah.
So I'll get into those in a little bit when you get to them.
Yeah. Well, we're headed there right now. I mean, so we think about Daniel, right? Just to kind of summarize so far, he's someone who's been called as God's people to be a faithful presence to the earth. So, the old covenant can be summarized through the promise of Abraham that you would be many people, that you'd be a blessing to all nations, and that ultimately, like it says in Exodus, that you would be a nation of kings and priests. And so that's like the mission of Israel as God's people, which most of the time they didn't do a good job of.
Right.
But so Daniel, that's his background, is he's like, okay, I am Yahweh's elect. He's called Israel out to be this. Now I'm in a land that's threatening to destroy that very thing, which obviously a lot of Israelites fought and died to stop, and they lost. So how is Daniel in the midst of that going to live in a way where he's faithful to his call as an Israelite, but also present to the mission of the Israelites in the midst of this culture?
Yeah.
So in the same way, we're in a culture where Christians are kind of exiled now. At least I would say. Some people still are trying to fight this fictitious culture war like we have a chance, but I think we've pretty well lost.
Yeah, actually, it was brought up in church a couple weeks ago that the number of Christians might be around the same as it used to be, but the number of true believers is not a big number anymore. Like it hasn't been shrinking, but it's not growing. It's just become this lukewarmness all across the board. And that, in my opinion, is just as bad.
Yeah.
So therefore, we are losing. Because if we're not growing, the other, and I say the other as in non-Christian, right?
Yeah, right.
It is growing. The secular world is growing. It's getting bigger. It's getting more powerful. And the Christians are kind of just plateaued in America right now, the way I see it.
Yeah. Well, and I think for a long time in American culture, we thought that we kind of had the upper hand. And a lot of that's true. I mean, I don't think that historically you can say that America was founded as like a Christian nation in the sense that it's in our policy.
Right.
It's not ingrained in the Constitution necessarily. It's influenced by that. But most of the nation was Christian. So in that sense,
it was just kind of assumed.
Exactly.
That, oh, yeah, you don't do these things.
Yeah, that like the common moral fabric of America was some sort of Christianity. And even the founding fathers, a lot of them were deist, but they had a sort of Judeo-Christian background.
Yeah.
And that was kind of upholding the whole thing. So that's where we came from. And so even, about 20, 30 years ago, even if most people at that point were moving away from faith in, most areas, they still kind of regarded Christians as having the moral, upright, majority.
Right.
So people would defer to them and be like, oh, they're more moral than I am, but I just don't want to live like that. Now it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of podcasts talking about this, so we won't dwell on that too much. The main thing is things are shifting, and we're finding ourselves in a culture that's increasingly hostile to living as a faithful Christian. And so there's, kind of like in Daniel's day, there's two typical main schools of thought with that. And one of them is kind of what you see in people who are getting really, really almost too political with their faith, where it's like, well, let's just take the whole system back and then we'll do it our way, and everyone else will be forced to live in our sort of Christian political paradise, which again, I don't know if that's what Jesus would do. So, and it's not what Daniel did. And I don't, even if it happened, I don't know if it would work, because then you would just have a bunch of people who feel like they're forced into this system they don't really subscribe to. The other
we know that that's not biblical. Forcing people into Christianity is not, it's not it.
Yeah, it's about invitation.
Yeah, it is. And it's about you accepting God on your own.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Well, and then the other extreme, and this one I think is another big temptation. I mean, there's some whole denominations built off this idea, is completely withdrawing. So instead of, trying to fight against the culture and win it back, this sort of idea wants to just completely seclude and say, well, they can, do what they want out there. We're just going to go have our little Christian club over here, and we'll pray and talk about Jesus and just wait for whatever's going to happen, and just let them do what they're going to do way over there.
Right.
So, but then that's ignoring the mission of Jesus completely.
And we actually talked about this in the next podcast, the movie one, how
we do.
That's what I want to do. So I'm going to go get involved in that stuff. And I'm going to use my faith in that world to influence people. And if I just go, I'm a Christian, so I can't be involved in that. Well, then who's reaching out to those people?
Absolutely.
Nobody. And so I think we're our calling to go out into the world. I mean, obviously, it's a great commission, right? So
it's not. There's no doubt about that one.
There's no doubt. So yeah. So I think that there's definitely both sides of what you just mentioned is wrong, and we need to be called to a clearer path down the middle of both those.
Yeah, and so that's really what I feel this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be a discussion of, okay, how do we avoid becoming just like the culture? And yet also, how do we avoid approaching it the wrong way? Because it's clear that we're supposed to be completely devoted to Jesus. Like, he is the King of Kings, right? And our devotion goes to him before anything. But also, we're supposed to be the life of the world, you know? Jesus came, and he was for the world, you know? Like John 3:16, the most classic verse that everyone is just like, oh my gosh, so cheesy. But it's true that he came so that, you know, all men might be drawn to him. And the church is supposed to engage in that mission with him. So if we're in this culture that's hostile, how do we do that in a way where we don't lose our faith, but we also can engage them in an honest, good mission? So I have an idea about how that works, by the way. And so when you look at the story of Daniel, I think the biggest thing that empowered him to be the way he was, and really all his friends, was what they did outside of, you know, the forced education and outside of being in the king's council. Because you're in the midst of this land, and if you don't do anything, you're going to be formed by it. Yeah. Everything you do is forming you constantly. So if you're in the midst of a culture which is the opposite of your faith, and you're not doing anything to counterform, you're going to be formed into the image of your culture. So if Daniel just went to the mandatory re-education and went to the councils that he was a part of and engaged in the culture, eventually he would have bowed down to their gods.
Absolutely.
Instead, he practiced his faith in ways that would sort of counterform him, and actually got in trouble for this. So one of the big stories, the whole lion's den story, actually was a result of him being caught praying, you know, just like a good Jew would, you know, multiple times throughout the day, and engaging in all the same rituals and practices that they could, obviously, outside of the temple. In the same way, I think that's what we should be doing, is talking about how do we identify the ways that culture is forming us, you know, antithetically to the way of Jesus, and then how do we counteract that? Yeah.
That's one of the issues that I've always dealt with movies. I'm just going to keep going back to that because I know
that's what you know,
is if I'm just constantly in that field of work and just submerged in this non-Christian world, it will take me over. Yeah. And I've felt at times when I'm just like, I'll be gone for 2 weeks working on a set, and I'm just like, oh man, I haven't really spent time in the Word and haven't been doing these things to get me back. And if I'm not doing that, it's super tempting to just go right into it. So you really have to set up, I mean, I don't want to say a list, but you got to have your routine, and you have to do these things that will keep you, I don't know, in the right mindset and doing what you're called to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw Daniel do it, and it worked for him. And more importantly, Jesus does it.
Yes.
Jesus has a very strict routine of spiritual disciplines that he's constantly following. He's always running away from whatever he's doing to pray and just practice silence and solitude. He fasts a ton, and then sometimes doesn't, which makes people mad when he doesn't, when everyone else is, you know. But then he's praying, he's fasting. He's always in community. He's always with his disciples. And, you know, there's probably countless other disciplines I could think of that Jesus is constantly engaging in. So if he's Jesus and he needs to do those things in the midst of Israel, how much more would we need to do them?
Yeah, very much. And I would say that's kind of the crux of anybody our age, really, is that we are so undisciplined right now as a culture.
It's almost a dirty word.
It is. We're like, oh, well, if you're too disciplined, then that's just following the checklist. It's like, at some point, a checklist can be helpful. And there are disciplines that you need to be implementing every single day, constantly, because Otherwise, you just can't handle that on your own.
Totally.
And that's the whole Bible's about that. Like, do not lean on your own understanding, but like let God help you.
Absolutely.
So therefore, why aren't we doing things to keep God on our mind at all times? Because I think that's kind of what this is what can I do to keep God on my mind? So that means reading the Bible when I get up. So that's the first thing on my mind. Then praying throughout the day to keep reminding myself. And then reading the Bible again at night. So when I'm going to bed, that's what's on my mind. If I'm not doing those things, everything else in the world, all this worldly stuff is going to be taking all my time.
Absolutely.
And that's the balance here, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think you were right when you said our culture has formed us enough to where we don't like the idea of discipline. One of the big things that our culture has shifted towards is this hyper independence, right? Where we're so independent. We don't like any formal authority. We don't like any structure. We don't like anything that would set limitations on who we are and what we're doing. And I think that's a big part of why we don't like the spiritual disciplines. And that's paired with a lot of people have kind of, ingrained it into us that they might be legalistic or whatever, but really they're not. It's really the best way to be formed into the image of Jesus. And it's not because you're earning it. It's because you're putting yourself in the way of the river of grace, right?
Yeah.
Like if grace is a river, the disciplines are a thing that puts you in the river so that you can drink more of it, right? If we're just standing outside talking about it and meanwhile we're in, the swamp of culture, that's what's going to be coating us.
Yeah.
And the good news about this, a lot of us, for me, this was a huge thing, is I started learning about these things. And I had no idea, no one ever taught me these things. I was like, what?
Yeah. And
I think that's, at least for people our age, young Christians, is the biggest thing is we don't really know how to pray consistently or maybe have, a structured scripture study that's actually beneficial and fills us up. We don't know how to fast. For Jesus, they just took that for granted. Like everyone knew how to fast.
Yeah.
And we're like, what is that even for?
I grew up in a Christian household with my dad was a starter of a home church and everything. Great family. Never had any problems with my family. And even then, and we're all Christians, we're all strong believers, but I still wasn't trained in disciplines. And I think that's probably my one regret growing up is that I wasn't, because now it's hard for me to get into them. And that was coming from a family that is like a very good Christian family. I can't imagine coming from no Christian background. That's got to be really hard to implement disciplines when you've never thought about disciplines in your entire life.
Absolutely. So that's going to be one of the big things we talk about. And I don't want it to just be like a podcast where it's just me like, oh, I did a study on fasting and we're going to have this deep, there's books on that.
Right.
But I think if we can talk about these things and have a conversation that makes it practical and is going to help us, live faithfully to Jesus and live on mission in the world, then absolutely we'll do a podcast on fasting and it'll be relevant, and I think that's what we need. Yeah. So counterformation is really the crux of what we're going to talk about. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about culture itself, with the one for film that you guys will see. That's the shameless plug to watch it. It's already recorded, so you better listen to it now. Yep. But the one on film is how do we, as Christians who are trying to form ourselves, engage with something that might be one of those mechanisms, whether intentional or not, that's trying to kind of destroy our faith or would destroy our faith if unchecked. We have to have the counterbalance of the disciplines to form us into the image of Jesus so that when we're interacting with the things that might sway us the other way, we can stand firm.
Yeah, and that standing firm, I was just thinking that is that he got thrown in the lion's den and wasn't like, oh, okay, I'll stop. Yeah. Right? He was like, all right, this is going to be it, and I'm going to trust God that he's going to get me through this because he's got me this far. Absolutely. And we need to be okay being thrown in a lion's den.
Whether figurative it is, or maybe literal, who knows?
Whatever that is. And but you have to have faith that God's going to get you through it. Because the second you don't think he's going to, well, then you've lost faith, and therefore, like you're on scary ground at that point.
Absolutely. Well, it's actually funny that you mentioned that too. When I was reading through Daniel just before recording this a couple of days ago, I noticed they're actually kind of sassy in how they confront Nebuchadnezzar about this sort of thing. So, for instance, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which that's their Babel names, they're not their Hebrew names. So they even renamed them. Like that's how crazy they were.
And that's the only names we know.
Yeah, no one knows their Hebrew names. They're in the book, but we don't call them by their Hebrew names.
Do you know their Hebrew names?
No, I don't remember
All right.
them. Next time we're going to talk about that. No, I'm just kidding. But when they're getting thrown into the furnace, it's because they're refusing to bow down to these gods, right? And that's with the looming threat of being thrown into this furnace if you don't bow down to these gods. And they don't just say, oh no, we'll just worship our God, thanks. They say, your gods are meaningless and we will never bow down to them, for our God is the true God. And they're like, well, we're going to throw you into the fire. And they go, that's fine. Our God can save us from the fire. And if he doesn't, we still worship the true God and he'll still be true. So they're like, well, he can save us, but even if he doesn't, it's worth it.
Yeah.
I was like, that's crazy. Would I say that? I don't think so.
Yeah, I've always thought, because I've had this question that I talk with people about, like, could I die for my faith?
Yeah.
And we think of that and we're like, I probably could. If somebody walked around with a gun, yeah, or whatever, I could die for my faith. But it's like, could you get tortured for your faith? Could you be burned alive for your faith? That's a lot more extreme than the instant death. Like, you think of that, and you're like, okay, it's over, whatever. The second you think about, oh wait, they almost wanted to get thrown into the furnace because they knew what God could do. Or if not, they were going to go see him.
Yeah.
And that's such a great mindset.
Totally. Well, I think it shows their devotion. They were convinced that it's not worth bending at all in that area, even if it meant death. And obviously our culture is not at that point yet. So that's where, the metaphor of Daniel's story kind of breaks down, because we're not being thrown into furnaces. But, I think for us, the furnace would be public humiliation maybe, or if not that, just being uncomfortable, which is like the mortal sin of our generation, being awkward or uncomfortable. I definitely think we should be willing to risk that. And that's not to say that we just get our bullhorn down or just like, this is what I believe. Because that's that's the opposite of the mindset of Daniel. But he was comfortable with being stressed and uncomfortable. That doesn't really make sense, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He was okay with that.
And the whole bullhorn thing you're talking about, that's a fine line. And people need to like realize it. There is a difference between going out and preaching your faith and going out and bullhorning your faith. And there's also a big difference in whenever somebody confronts you, then you're very bold about it, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we are called to be very bold in our faith. And so if somebody approaches me and says, why are you a Christian? I need to not be timid about this. I need to be bold about it. They were bold about it. They're like, throw us in there because our God is the God.
Yeah, absolutely. But they didn't start with that.
Right.
And that's where like the discernment comes in. So we'll talk about all those things. For now, just know that, it's confusing and hard to be a Christian today. And it can be really tempting to just kind of want to be a Christian and maybe show up to church, but also do a lot of the stuff that the culture does, or maybe just ditch it all together. Just as it can be tempting to want to completely separate and maybe go be Amish or something, not literally, but in a sense that we don't even want to deal with the world at all. So there's got to be a middle ground, and that's what we're absolutely committed to exploring. So we'll start talking about some of those disciplines, and we'll start talking about how to engage in culture. And again, everyone who shared ideas, a lot of you had really great ideas that we're going to try to incorporate and make sure we cover. If you have more questions, keep sending them to us. I want to make sure that this is something that's created for you and empowers young Christians to live faithfully on mission in today's world. So anything that you are confused about, whether it be theological or practical, just shoot us an email. It's going to be in the description below. I read it as often as they come through. So I'll make sure that we can cover a lot of those things. And then we'll get some other people on here. We'll interview some leaders, some more peers, and talk about those things. Next one's going to be about film. We have that episode already recorded, as we've said like 6 times. So watch that. That'll be a good way to think about how we can engage film as Christians. And then we'll start diving into some of the disciplines. I think I have an episode planned on studying scripture, and then one on Sabbath, actually. Nice. So that's what's coming. And again, if you guys benefit from this podcast at all, please go ahead, leave a comment or review on whatever platform you're on. That really helps us out since we're just getting started. And if you know someone who's interested in this sort of thing or could benefit from it, or you just really liked it, please share it. That would be great. That really helps us, again, get the word out and get more people involved in the conversation.